there was a Harvard study in 2020 that found that men who are involved in religious worship services faithfully are 33% less likely to die by suicide or drug overdose. 33%. For women, the correlation is twice as strong. 68% less likely to die alone effectively. That is a huge correlation. And yet we live in a nation that says, oh, I'm not religious. Really? I'm not traditional. Really? Are you, after the week of the 4th of July, are you really going to try to pull that one on me? I mean, did you see that we actually have fireworks stands and there's no lack of business and there was no lack of booming? I mean, our dogs are still shaking from all the fireworks that were launched this week. That's a tradition, folks. When we lean on traditions, they aren't bad. In fact, traditions are important because rehearsing our history shapes our destiny. Every sociologist will notice that. Every anthropologist would say, yes, a nation that no longer has traditions is in trouble. Our traditions, they can remind us where they come from. They help us to shape our future. And the best traditions that exist point to God. 2,500 years ago, Jewish people started a festival, an observance called Purim. And that's what the book of Esther is about. If you want to know what is the book of Esther is about, it's effectively answering the question, what is Purim and why do we celebrate it? Now, it's also about God's sovereignty. It's also about his providence. But here we notice in this festival, this is a beautiful festival, and it's not a hard pitch because it is one big party of feasting and of drinking, where kids, they will dress up because they are hiding their identity, just like Esther hid her identity all those years ago, where the children, instead of like with our trick-or-treating with Halloween, where they go and knock on doors and demand food from other people, wherever Purim is celebrated, you will find Jewish kids, they will instead give food. They will give gifts away. They will give gifts to the poor, because that is what the celebration of Purim is all about. And that is what we start to see that is being entrenched, that is being codified in the Jewish consciousness. These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So what is this celebration, this festival that we call Purim? Now, you may not have noticed it at first, but now that I point it out, maybe you'll see that it seems like Mordecai, who's writing this section of Esther, it seems, he seems to be laboring over the idea of this word Purim over and over and over. And if you're anything like me, whether for good or ill, then you might be saying to yourself, okay, you're Jewish. Why are you having to explain to other Jewish people how you do your Jewish things together? Here's the reason why. Because the word Purim is not a Jewish word. I grew up in Orlando, and there were many times that we would go pick up people at the Orlando International Airport, friends or whatnot, and we would go from one concourse to the other, and there was this really cool thing that came out in the 80s. It was called a tram. They're now, everyone's like, yeah, of course. But to me, that it was the coolest thing. It was like you got a free train ride. And part of the free train ride, however, was an explanation of where you are and where you disembark and all those kinds of things. And it would be in 2 languages because, well, Florida, okay? And so you had it in English, you had it in Spanish. So in English, it said all the stuff that I knew what it said. And then, since I am a gringo, effectively, since I don't speak Spanish fluently or even remotely, I would hear something that sounded like this. Walt Disney World. Okay, that's what I would hear. And that's, if you're a Jewish person, that's what you're hearing. You're hearing stuff, except it's the opposite. It's stuff that we understand what it says, and then blah, blah, blah. That's the word Purim, because the word Pur is a Persian word that's thrown into a Jewish document. That's kind of different. And so as we look at this, we can understand. So why is he going on about Purim so much? Because Purim is a day we should remember, because it is the day that God remembered us. We should remember Purim because it is the day that God remembered us. This is coming from a Jewish standpoint. Now, we'll get to a Christian standpoint later on, or maybe a Westerner standpoint in a few minutes. But the passage here is calling for 2 things: to remember and to rejoice. Remember and rejoice. Those are the 2 simple breakouts of this passage. In verse 20, Mordecai makes this clear enough that he records all these things. He wants you to remember these things. If you don't do anything else, reader, remember the day of Purim. And you're supposed to, in verse 21, keep the day. I'm looking here in the New International Version, and it seems to say the same thing. It says in verse 21, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th day of the month of Adar. That's not what a more literal translation, like, say, the English Standard or the King James or the New American Standard will have. It will say the word keep. And the word keep has a certain flavor to it if you're reading it on a Jewish level. It's the same kind of word that was used for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. When they were in the Garden of Eden, they were supposed to keep the garden, right? What does that mean? Guard. It's the word to guard it. That effectively, Adam, you're the bouncer in the garden. Because this is a sacred space, and you are supposed to protect it from things like, like snakes, chaos creatures. You're supposed to do that. You're supposed to protect it. You're supposed to guard it. You're supposed to. Now, what does it mean here in this passage? Guarding the day, what does that mean? That means that you keep celebrating it. See, the NIV is right. In effect, what that means is to celebrate that day. How do we guard the day? We guard it by celebrating it. The same can be said of the Lord's Day. And more will be said about the Lord's Day in a few minutes. And you'll also notice in verse 27, what is said here is the Jews took it upon themselves, or they obligated themselves to establish the customs that their descendants and all who had joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year. They were placing themselves under obligation. Obligation bad, though, Bill. No, obligation good. Okay, as you're looking at this, this is required. It's not an option. In every clan, in every province, in every city, and that those days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews. Now, so the first idea is to remember this day. What does that mean? That means to guard it. What does that mean? That means to celebrate it. And so that brings us to our second point. You see how seamlessly it brings us into this idea of rejoicing. It's a day for remembering, but it's a day for rejoicing. How do you remember the day? You remember the day by rejoicing in it. See, is God giving you theological shredded wheat that you have to eat? Now, maybe you like shredded wheat. I don't. Okay. So some of you may be like, shredded wheat, good. Well, whatever you don't like, okay? That thing you don't like eating, well, Brussels sprouts. I love Brussels sprouts. Well, find something. Whatever that thing is you don't like. And God's not giving you something you don't want. He's giving you a course for rejoicing. Because how do we remember things? We remember doing the things that we enjoy doing, the things that give us pleasure, the things that give us delight. And this is what God is giving his people. He's giving them a day of delight. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th day, they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. And that idea is going to be repeated. And they made it a day of feasting and joy. Verse 19, that is why rural Jews, those living in the villages, observe the 14th month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Now go with me to verse 22. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. What does this mean for you, Christian? It means that when you have been delivered in some way, how should you remember that day? By rejoicing. God does not call you to go on 20-mile hikes, with a backpack on up a steep grade. He calls you to rejoice. What does rejoicing look like? Well, rejoicing looks like making it a day of feasting, a day of joy, a day of giving presents to each other. That seems a lot like fellowship, doesn't it? He's calling us to a lifestyle of worship. He's calling these people to a lifestyle of fellowship. What is he also calling them to in verse 22? On top of that, it's also, and gifts to the poor. God is calling his people there in the Old Testament to a lifestyle of worship, a lifestyle of fellowship, a lifestyle of kindness and generosity. And that is what the Lord's Day should be for us. Because Purim, for them, it was a day where they celebrated. Why? Because they had been delivered. If you go back to, say, Exodus chapter 20, and you read the beginning part of the Ten Commandments, not the one that says, you shall love the Lord your God, not that part, the part that's just before that, the part that's called the preface, where it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery, out of the house of bondage. That is the ground for why you keep the Ten Commandments. You have already been delivered. You have already been rescued. You don't have to keep those 10 Commandments so that God will deliver you. You've already been delivered. Now live like it. Live like redeemed people. Live like free people. The New Testament is not giving you a checklist of things that you have to do to earn God's love. You already have his love, people of God. This should change the way that you live your life. This should absolutely change everything. Because you're not waiting around for God to give you the good stuff when you do good stuff. But is that what your neighbors think that God's like? Absolutely. And if you're listening online, God isn't like that. He is far too good. He loves you far too much. He is not a God who's saying, okay, what have you done for me lately? Because you know what he knows about us? He knows that we're dust. He knows that we can't do it. That's why he sent Jesus Christ. That's why he gave us a way out. That's why he gave us a path to deliverance. And throughout the Old Testament, we read that. And Purim is starting to show us that day, what that looks like. Now, why are they celebrating? They're celebrating because this horrible guy came named Haman. He had an evil plan. In verses 24 and 25, you'll see that summarized out for you, that he had an evil plan that was returned upon his head. I got to tell you this story about this guy from Minnesota, not from Florida, This was not Florida man, all right? This was Minnesota man. Minnesota man goes to California and he says, oh, hey, nice jewelry store. I think I'll keep it. Actually, he goes into a J.C. Penney and he brings a hammer and he smashes the jewelry counter and he starts reaching in there for watches and jewelry of all kinds, thousands of dollars worth of stuff. Two other guys, they see this happening and they tackle him. Well, Minnesota man, what's his name? Stephen Stanley. You should have known better, Stephen. He then starts swinging at them with a hammer. And then he pulls out a can of pepper spray. And he tries to get the people. He shoots it in his own eyes. Just desserts. He's incapacitated by his own spray. He is then arrested for robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and drug charges. That is a recent example, last May, that is a recent example of what happened to Haman. It was that kind of thing. In Ecclesiastes chapter 10, it says, the man who digs a pit will fall into it. It's that same kind of justice that comes around. But why should we celebrate the demise of Haman? Because God used a device of doom for their deliverance. See, at this time, Haman, he starts rolling dice. This is not because he had some sort of a gambling addiction. Okay, that's not what the dice that he was using. The pur is the Persian word for dice. So the whole reason why you have this festival called Purim is it's about dice. No, this is not something where you'll need to go to a 12-step program. This is, Haman thought he was rolling the dice to establish the day of the annihilation of the Jews. Why did he do that? Because he thought by doing that, that was his God's way of establishing his plans. He's rolling the dice saying, okay, my gods, whichever ones I worship, tell me which day. The only problem is it was about 11 months after he was rolling the dice. Why? Because he didn't count on something. He didn't count on the fact that God is in control even of the roll of the dice. He didn't count on the fact that the day that he wanted to kill the Jew Mordecai, that evening the king couldn't sleep. And because he couldn't sleep, he was reading about all of his awesome deeds. The I'm So Awesome book, or Chronicles, or whatever they called it. And because of that, the king said to Haman, I want you to honor this person who actually he wanted to curse, who he wanted to dishonor. And he didn't count on the fact that the queen was a Jew as well. He didn't count on any of those things. All these things turned his world upside down. This is what we are getting to celebrate here. And as a Jewish person, as they are celebrating Purim, is that they belong to a God who remembers them. They belong to a God who turns all the evil plans of the Hamans of this world upside down. But I want to tell you something, Christian. The Lord's Day, this day, is better than Purim. The Lord's Day is better than Purim. Purim comes once a year. The Lord's Day comes every week. Purim was a deliverance of only the Jews. On the Lord's Day, what do we celebrate? We celebrate that God is rescuing every tongue, tribe, and nation for all who will turn upon the Lord, who will call upon the name of the Lord. Those are the ones who will be saved. On Purim, it was a day in the past. They're celebrating something that's in the past. What is today, the Lord's Day? It's our present. It is our present. It is also our future. Because the Lord's Day is more than just a clever way of talking about Sunday. It's the day when we are commemorating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let's go back to the dice. Remember, that was a device for doom that God used to absolutely upend things. 2,000 years ago, the rulers of Jerusalem, they thought that they would put Jesus on a cross, a device for doom. They thought they would upend him, but they themselves were upended. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That is what we read in the Psalms. That is what is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And the Lord's Day, it shows that he triumphs over death. He triumphs over hell. He triumphs over all the forces of darkness. It shows that Satan has been defeated and that we have hope. That we have been forgiven. That we have been restored. That this is what the Lord's Day is about. It's called the Day of Rest, right? Rest is a shortened way of talking about restoration. That Jesus is restoring all things. He is making all things new. Purim celebrates the day when the Jews triumphed over their enemies. Here's how good the Lord's Day is. The Lord's Day reminds us that even though we were still God's enemies, Christ died for us. That is how much better the Lord's Day is. The Lord's Day, Purim, was a day of rest and feasting and celebration, and the Lord's Day is a day of rest and feasting and celebration. And don't hear me wrong. I'm not trying to downgrade Purim. Purim is a fantastic day. It is a day that is rightly reverenced by Jews everywhere for 2,500 years. I'm just telling you that the Lord's Day is that much better. That God loves us, that he reigns supreme, that device of doom that was supposed to upend everything was the very thing that God so cleverly used to defeat the forces of darkness, because the Lord is a warrior and he fought our battles for us, and so we are free by the resurrection.